AFL. Australians, we're quite lucky in the fact that we have a long lead-in, a long prep period, about 3 to 4 months. So for those of you listening in Europe and work in different sports where your prep period is much shorter, some of these examples you're probably going to shake your head at. But I guess what I want to do is make us all aware and reflect on how specific and intentional we are with our programming. So I'll give a bit of an overview of what we're going to look at today. So we'll look at the whys and whats of testing, and then just go into our conditioning and sort of have a bit of a view from about 38,000 feet and then drill down into it. And hopefully along the way I can provide you with some specific examples so you can wrap your head around the philosophies that I'm presenting to you. We'll talk about some athlete monitoring, in particular some submaximal fitness tests. So why do we test? Why do we test? Well, the physical testing and particularly maximal testing has probably been a topical issue over the past couple of years and maybe longer than that. And it's fair to say that we're probably working in a continuum where in some areas we might test, in some areas we might not be as lucky to test. The reasons why we test are pretty simple. We get a snapshot of performance for any given physical or physiological construct, whether that be aerobic fitness, and that gives us a bit of a fitness and fatigue guide. We can prescribe exercise, which I'll circle back to. Benchmark performance, whether that be across positions, positional groups, levels of competition, and hopefully we're utilising it across other areas of our performance department. Where it tends to fall down is that we become too time poor, so time doesn't allow us to do it. We might do a cost-benefit analysis and there's some bigger fish to fry, some other things that we want to try to focus our energies on. The culture of our environment and setup might dictate that we aren't able to do some maximal testing. And probably the growth of silent testing and monitoring systems has pushed some away, whether that be just focusing on an internal load, internal construct to any given external load. For today's, I'm going to chat about the benefits of testing and how that can tie in specifically with prescription of training. So when we're testing, I think a big reason it falls down is that we don't necessarily know why and what we're testing. We need to have a clear aim when we go to test and have a strong understanding of the physiological or physical function that we are testing and understand whether that is actually meaningful to performance and meaningful to performance during match play. We need to understand what we're using it for, whether that be test, retest, assessment of our programming, start and end of pre-season. If someone's poor, we need to understand how we're going to improve that, given we've now created a foundation saying it is important to performance. And we should be pushing for bang for buck outcomes. So again, across department, trying to understand how we can utilize this. Importantly, we probably need to understand who is using it. Is it just the performance team? Is it just sports scientists, strength and conditioning coaches that are engaged? Are coaches, tactical, technical coaches engaged with the process? Are players invested in it? It's not saying that needs to be a necessity, but it certainly helps when you've got a clear message to the players around why you're doing it and how it's going to relate to them. So we all know the adage, less is more, and it's a great philosophy. And what this philosophy allows us to do is be accountable with what we're doing, whether it be minimal dose for any given stimulus. It provides intent for what we're trying to achieve. Now, what if I told you that we could try to extrapolate that thought process across more is more? So if we take that minimalist idea and then provide that across our performance department, across our structures, to try to get more information that might dictate more of our prescription, might dictate more of our monitoring systems. And obviously this is dependent on your context, and I'll try to steer well clear of this contextual out. But yeah, your program, your individualization, the culture of what you're doing is obviously all dependent on that. So to provide you some examples of what we and I've typically tested when looking at conditioning, here is 4 examples of within a pre-season some aerobic and anaerobic based fitness tests. And you might certainly look at that and say that's absolutely overkill, but I'll hopefully drill down and show you what we can get out of that by testing more. And it's probably appropriate to say here that I think we often forget that when we do any sort of physical test, particularly a conditioning test, it is part of a conditioning element to it. So there's certainly an option to have that built in within your sessions. So if we look at the 30 to 15 intermittent fitness test, and a lot of my, I guess, previous research has been revolved around this, and it's a great test to use for a variety of factors. And so we would typically do this. It's one of our staples. We would use from this result, we would have a conditioning progression stream that would filter through our pre-season and into the season. From a monitoring perspective, we'd also have a submaximal fitness test that was based off these thresholds. We also use it to individualize our speed thresholds within our GPS monitoring. I'll come back to a couple of those in a little bit. Our 1.2 kilometre time trial, this is a linear time trial. Typically utilize that to do a lot of our early conditioning, particularly with our younger athletes that might come in earlier. More your traditional, I'll call it MAS work for the ease of today, but yeah, that traditional longer sort of work, boxes and the like. We then have a 1.2 kilometre shuttle test, which is a 20 returns, 40 return, 60 return, 5 of those. And again, we program some conditioning streams off that. And we find for those who work in rugby or rugby league, that test has been, I guess, coined around the world as the Bronco test. And so working at the Broncos when I was there, we utilise it as almost a psychological test. These kids were exposed to it at such a young age, and there was certainly a psychological element to the test that they had to overcome. And an anaerobic capacity test, which I can go into more detail offline with you if you want to learn about that. We have capacity and power streams that sort of filter off that. So again, a lot of testing, but do we use it? So those first three tests we do. We also look at individual needs conditioning, which a lot of comes off the back of that. So for example, if you do your 1.2 time trial and then you run a slower time than expected on your 1.2 shuttle compared to the rest of the group, we might look at potentially focusing on some change of direction efficiency work at a submaximal pace. If then you perform poorly at 30-15, we then might look at some inter-effort recovery ability exercises. All right, so when we start getting into our conditioning stuff, which I'll get into soon, we can have a clear focus about who needs to get a bit more of a top up of what. And I'll get into these two for the remainder of our chat. So conditioning resources. I started my PhD in 2012, looking at HIIT and testing and prescription and monitoring of HIIT. And I was lucky enough that in 2013, Martin Bichart and Paul Larson, who Paul's speaking twice today, so I urge you listen to him and Martin's talking as well. But if you haven't read these and you're involved in and around fitness of any capacity, or strength conditioning, sports science, whatever you work on, I urge you to go read these. These are the absolute Bible to me, going through that process and certainly develop my foundation of knowledge on both the physiological and adaptive responses to HIIT. So in this work, Paul and Martin suggest that there are 9 variables that we can manipulate in order to adapt the response and internal response we get from a given HIIT stimulus. I think this has been adapted now, and there are more variables that have been added to this, but it certainly shows you how malleable high intensity interval training is in order to get a specific or targeted outcome. So further from this work then looked at a specific metabolic and neuromuscular load of HIIT, and it allows us again to really target some specific systems to create load, overload, and then adaptation from that. You can see in this framework that they've put together, we've got factors up the top that obviously feed down into our prescription. One of those being athletes, sport demands, and I'll probably just reframe this for how I've used it in the environment. So a lovely flower here. But as Selwyn sort of touched on before, there's an athlete-centric approach, and we're moving more and more towards this athlete-centric approach. Now within HIIT, that might be difficult, but what we're trying to do is essentially look at these different pedals, if you will, for this example, and trying to make sure we tick these boxes off as we progress systematically throughout our pre-season or in season. So they are the specific adaptation progressions, which I've sort of talked about. This is just simply energy system development, if you want to call it that. Player deficiencies and efficiencies, all right, strengths and weaknesses, and not necessarily always focusing on weaknesses. So the sport demands and positional demands specifically. This is something that, I guess, depending on what sport you're in, there's certainly a lot of ways. I mean, conditioning in general, there's a lot of ways to skin the cat. But specifically here, my philosophies are around systematically improving certain capacities for that athlete to then translate that into the most specific thing that they will do, which is skills and then a game. So it's about providing that athlete with the capacity to undertake those skills at a high enough intensity that the coaches are desiring. Finally, we look at that team-based work. And ultimately, whenever you're dealing with team sport athletes, once they cross that white line, they're working together. And there's certainly some psychology and psychological factors that are embedded in physical work that players need to learn to develop as they proceed through the preseason. And this might be trust with teammates, it might be communication under fatigue, but it's about putting them in stressful situations, whether you deem that, producing anti-fragile athletes, but it's about putting them under stressful situations and seeing how they cope with that and seeing development as we go along the preseason. Now, this is all great, but when we're dealing with 20, 30, 40, maybe even 50 players, you look at collegiate systems and we're talking about thousands of players. How are we going to provide that model to every single athlete? Well, hopefully I'll provide you some examples about how I've previously done it to give you some insights there. So whenever we're looking at a macro cycle, I try to look at it as what physiological functions are we aiming to target, and then looking at time. So this might be, depending on how systematic your process is, this might be quite linear, or we might include a more vertically integrated periodized method where we're hitting different functions across different days. All right, there's certainly no right or wrong area, and we've got concurrent training when we're dealing with these team sport athletes and they're in the gym. So there's certainly a lot of factors that we need to consider, but I'll probably take you through the methods that I've seen be quite successful. So here's a little video. I wasn't sure about the screen sharing, how we'd go. This is an overview of our sort of macro cycles. This is looking at a bit of the preseason. So along the Y here, we're talking about our physiological functions. X is just time. So you can see we've got different groups returning on different times. We've got different sessions built in. Different groups will do different sessions at that time as well. In rugby league, we've got a lot of contact to worry about. So you can see as I scroll down here, we've got a focus of each week. We've then got elements that we find important and need to periodize, and that might be, as I said, running efficiency might be a focus, higher intensity mechanical load, more team-based work, ground recovery and wrestle. And then we'll build that out for the different groups returning at different times. Again, they'll be integrated into the main group at different periods. And this is the main group for the back end of preseason. So the model I've sort of worked off is an introduction, integration, and intensification across the preseason. But hopefully that provides you a bit of an overview of how we can almost simplify it so we can get some great results. Taking that down and drilling that down into a daily view, well, how does that look in practice? So these are some daily run sheets. This is early on in pre-season, early December. And what you can see here is we've got a bit more of an individualized energy system development on this day. There's a couple of different streams of testing. We've got some individualized work with the 30-15 IFT, some anaerobic capacity and power. That's dependent on their testing results, as I previously talked about. And again, happy to go into that offline. And then some positional work as well. When we get to the back end of preseason, it becomes a bit more complex. So here we've got some individualized energy system development, some modified guys, some guys that have been back later that might be doing something else. We then move into our individual needs session, where guys will filter down into a different group based on some testing or based on where we deem them to sit at. Now, if they haven't tested since the start of preseason, and this is 2 months later, we don't necessarily hold them to the testing that they did. It is a fluid situation, and I urge you to be fluid in that, and we're dealing with humans, and on a given day, any player might need something different to work with. We then move into some positional work, beg your pardon, and then some team conditioning toward the end of it. So you can see where we're ticking all those boxes, and players might float into different phases. And obviously you have to have the resources to be able to coach all those, which is obviously integral to physically coach the conditioning as opposed to just letting them run. But that's, we found that to be rather successful. And then into skills. What I'll do now is drill down into, further down into some 30-15 IFT work. So Martin Bischheit's obviously come up with a fantastic test. And if you haven't read too much about the 30-15 intermittent fitness test, again, I urge you to try to get out there and do some reading. But what Martin prescribed from his work, we try to apply in rugby league athletes. So rugby league athletes, to give you an example, are typically anywhere from 80 to 120 kilos. You can imagine within that scope, we've got athletes who possess quite heterogeneous physical and physiological attributes. And so particularly with these heavier guys, when running anything more than sort of 4 minutes at a reasonably intensity, their posture becomes quite poor and they start to sink into it. And obviously we want people to run well whilst they're doing the activity. And so we started to manipulate some of those variables. And this is what we ended up coming up with. It's by no means just primarily high intensity interval training. Some of it goes past that scope. We certainly don't hit every single one of those. We might flutter between, but it provides us with a bit of a direction around what we're trying to achieve and the focus of that session. So for those of you, again, I apologize for the video, but for those of you who again haven't seen it, we just created a spreadsheet. We had the 30-15 scores. You can see we've got guys who've got 16.5, which is shocking for an elite athlete. And then we just funnel this into Martin's spreadsheet. This is freely available on Martin Bischheit's website, I believe still. And I'm more than happy to link that in, and Martin might touch on that later as well, and Paul as well. So what we can do here is change the prescription, the velocity that we're running at. All right, typically we run 30 seconds off, and a 30-second shuttle seems to be a good distance for our guys where they can run well and still get in and out of their breaks. All right, something to probably note here is that any time that someone did, so to talk you through this, this athlete is running 115 meters because of the shuttle. They've got 3 shuttles of 30 meters and then a 25 meter on their last shuttle. So they take off the last 5 meters. Anytime an athlete has less than 5 meters after a turn, we tend to just run them through that last turn. So they'll run 3 shuttles, but then they might run, 35 meters on that last effort. Because what we find when guys fatigue is that we get really poor change of direction mechanics coming out of that, and we become quite sloppy. So we prefer them to run through. So that's just a personal preference. We had a couple of meters on. Again, there's a bit of liberal changes that we sort of make to that on the fly. All right, so I'll push into some athlete monitoring tool monitoring in this section, and specifically looking at our toolbox. We've got some great speakers on throughout the day, some touching on this. So I know what you're all thinking. As soon as I get up here and start talking about this, I'm sure I've lost half of you when I start to put a lot of those up. So I've tried to make it a bit more sexy. And what is more sexy to talk about than GPS, heart rate, RPE, wellness, musculoskeletal, and jumping than submaximal fitness tests? All right, so we're going to have a bit of a delve into the world of submax now, and I'll hopefully give you some insights about the application of this in the field, and give you some takeaways. So submaximal fitness tests offer a valid and feasible method of quantifying physiological function, as opposed to doing a maximal test, which I've previously talked about. So if you had some issues in the why not column, this is an alternative that might allow you to really drive some insights. And it's easy and feasible as doing a 4-minute block at the end of a warm-up. Essentially what we're looking at here is how an athlete responds to a given external load. So what their internal response is to a given external load. And from here, we can start to infer some fitness and fatigue from that athlete. Again, I urge you to go and read some more of Martin's work. He hasn't set me up here just to to quote a number of his studies, but it is a great paper. That again, Billy Hewlin has done some great work in rugby league on this space. Joel Garrett, guys down at Port Adelaide, and I'm not sure if Burjo will touch on some of this stuff later on, but there's certainly some great practitioners that are utilising this method and seeing some great results. So a big issue that we had was that, as I said, we've got heterogeneous athletes. So we've got athletes that some are quite competent in their physiological functioning, and some are quite poor. So the methods that were out there typically used a continuous test around a field, 12 kilometres an hour, a yo-yo IR1 for 4 to 6 minutes. And we sort of looked at that and thought that it might not be sensitive, because we might get guys finishing in completely different thresholds of their percent of heart rate max. So again, we went back and we looked at the 30-15, and given the success that we had utilising the 30-15 to prescribe work, we thought we might be able to see some of this with prescribing some submaximal work. So we tinkered around a fair bit to come up with what is quite an easy number, which is 60% of their 30-15 score. Some of the issues that we're facing is that we wanted to fit it across a field, just to limit the amount of setup that we would have. And we also wanted to make sure that it fit within those thresholds, as I was mentioning before, the bands that we typically like to see in the last minute or 30 seconds of a submaximal fitness test. And that's typically around the 80 to 90%. All right, so what we did is we've done some work which is unpublished at the moment, but we looked at some retest reliability across our players and these 3 different tests. So that's a bit of a plot of one player doing all 3 tests. And we're specifically worried about that last minute or last 30 seconds, and you're taking the average heart rate of that. What we found was that the IFT fit nicely, smack bang between that 80 and 90% of heart rate max for the final 60 seconds. The continuous test, again, was good, and so was the yo-yo IR1. So they're all pretty similar, and we're getting the same end result. However, when we looked at the typical errors, this is the within player random variation, we find that the IFT 60 was almost twice as tight or had far less noise associated with it than the continuous and yo-yo IR1. Now, what I will point out is that they're both still very reliable tests. And we did see a systematic mean change in the IFT, but when we look at within player, it is quite tight. So there was trivial differences between that test retest. So this is good news, and it provided us with a platform to utilise this in the field and delve a bit more deeper into what is actually a real and meaningful change. From here, we thought we needed to associate what our thresholds were going to be for a likely change. And whether we cast that at small, moderate or large, we had quite a few discussions around that. So a small likely change is deemed a physiological change. But what we considered was that when we're doing a test retest, we're doing it within a week period. And so that is showing you the variation that will happen between that week. Now, if we extrapolate that over a season, we're going to get far more variables that come into play, external variables, whether that be weather conditions, field firmness, whether that be players taking a coffee, drinking a coffee before, which is obviously something that we try to mitigate, but I'm sure you'll all appreciate with given athletes that may not be always the case. So we ended up looking at what was a moderate likely change, and that sort of inferred our practice. Again, heart rate recovery, those graphs on the right-hand side. So after they've done their 4-minute run, so in this test, they run a continuous 4 minutes at 60% of their IFT, they're 20-second shuttles. And then they stand with hands on hips for 2 minutes. And we take their heart rate at a 1 minute standpoint and 2 minute standpoint and look at percent decrement from their 30-second, final 30-second or 60-second heart rate. And that gives us a bit of an indice on their ability to recover and any potential blunting of heart rate response. So this is all fantastic, and it's a scientific driven approach, but what does this mean to the real world? And how do we unpack this with all this information? So this is an example of what our visualization looked like on the back end. And so what we can get here is looking at and applying our different thresholds, the likelihood that change was actually substantial. and to what degree that was substantial change. And then we can plot that along with other indices of external load, internal load, RPE, heart rate, different GPS metrics, and we can have a look at some potential associations between what we're seeing with their physiological function and also their external load. And importantly here, this one's mapped against that load is a VT2. It's an estimated second ventrally threshold, which is some of our derived 3015 IFT derived thresholds. Again, you can plot that against anything, but that's what you're sort of looking at there. Down the bottom in blue, heart rate recovery at 60. Again, there's more noise associated with that indice. I must say that the players were quite good and were far better than I thought at standing with hands on hips without talking, without moving around, but there's still some natural fluctuations there and greater noise associated with that. So it did make it a bit more difficult. We didn't really see many changes. Reporting that on the group level and how we can take that to coaching staff and I guess try to make some meaningful changes and systematic changes. Here's a bit of a longitudinal look on some of our key players and my interpretation of those results. So be it if they're in green, they've had a meaningful change from their last data point. Amber or the yellow there, they've just stayed as is. And red's gotten worse. Now, red getting worse can mean one of two things. Obviously, this is an assessment of both fitness and fatigue. You can't dichotomize the two. The two are interrelated. And at any given point, an athlete sits somewhere on that continuum. For the person above, in this example, they were an athlete who was a 20-year-old player playing their first NRL season, and their workload was through the roof consistently. Right? They were eager to please. They were continually doing a lot of work. And we see a slow progression. If you look at in January, so that January blocks after 10 days off after Christmas, we see athletes drop dramatically when you take away that acute fatigue, and they slowly build back up. All right, once we get started playing in March, he's basically flatlining that whole time. What we try to do with this athlete is actually, before we take away anything, before we deload anything, given he's a 20-year-old, he's not a 34-year-old, we try to add recovery modalities in. So we add before we subtract and see how we go there. Luckily enough, we've got a fair amount of research on individualized recovery modalities. And so we're able to target specific modalities that would help that athlete. And, you know, from August, September, October, we went into our finals. So hopefully we can make a real change there. The second red marker, that 92%, was a front row forward who hadn't played much game time. All right, he was an older player, hadn't played much game time, and that's why, you know, we understood that as being a lack of fitness. And all this data isn't done in isolation. It's compared to our neuromuscular measures, it's compared to our wellness, our subjective wellness, our GPS, external, internal load metrics as well. Across a pre-season, we then look at how an athlete responded to the pre-season. I'll talk about how we can target HIIT strategies for individuals. Well, how do they respond to that targeted approach? Obviously, HIIT is just one little bit of the pie, and it's highly multifactorial on all their work that they're doing within the gym, within skills, and then the 16 hours they're outside of the facility. But this gave us an insight into who specifically responded to pre-season and the likelihood of that response. I know I'm running short of time here, so I'll just push through this. So we can then, I guess, cross-reference that with, did the athlete respond to the 3015 IFT? Was there fitness change there? Again, that fitness fatigue response isn't exclusive to SUBMAX. That'll happen in maximal testing as well. And then heart rate response as well. Again, the noise associated with that makes that rather difficult. So to summarize now, particularly with our testing protocols, it's really important that we have a strong rationale behind what we do. We understand the what, why, and how. I think that's something we're moving down now. We're trying to get a bit too specific with tests and lose sight of the underlying function of what we're trying to validly and reliably assess. Understand the information that we're getting and how we can manipulate this to different processes of conditioning, but across the department to improve athlete performance. Create an athlete-centered approach and an adaptive-centered approach to allow greater specificity in our programming. We can tailor submaximal tests as a simple way to monitor our athletes. And above all else, to be robust with our methods. That may be data-driven, but then have the human element, and the interpretation of that is highly individualized. So be fluid with our implementation of how we deliver that. I didn't get a dad joke in there, so there's one on the right. So thank you very much.
Cheers, Tan. Thank you for that. I was going to say there's some great gifts in there, and yeah, I was expecting a few more dad jokes. So,
yeah, I know. I was poor. Poor performance at the end of the day.
Yeah, to be honest with you, there's a lot of the presenters from later on in the day are going to be really happy with you talking about how uncool like performance monitoring is and stuff like that. So,
I can imagine.
for the guys out there, just while I'm trying to find Ibby, yeah, when you guys did the submax testing, like how did you decide which one would be best for your rugby league athletes, and do you think the test that you chose would be appropriate for other sports as well?
Yeah. So I've sort of come from the lineage that more individualization is better, and we sort of took that approach with submaximal work. I'm lucky enough to work with a couple of smarter people than me, that being yourself and Sean McLaren, who's speaking later on this project, and then had a great high performance manager in Jeremy Hickmans, who really challenged us to get it right. And so that approach, looking at and reflecting on how individualized we were across some of our prescription and HIIT prescription in general, and the player buy-in we had because of that, and them understanding that it's about getting them better. That really led into the buy-in around an individualized submax test. And the theory makes sense to me, that at the end they were looking for an outcome that is a consistent physiological outcome. So we need to try to standardize that external dose we need to try to standardize that internal dose. So we need to manipulate that external dose in order to do that.